of the camp, thought he saw something moving in the trees. Whipping his musket to his shoulder, he fired blindly into the gloom, mortally wounding a Kickapoo warrior as he attempted to steal into the camp. Harrison himself was in his tent when the first shot rang out, followed by a series of blood-curdling war cries and a tremendous crash of muskets as the war party rushed in. The Battle of Tippecanoe had begun.
It was a classic Indian attack. If you don't have the numbers on your side, you make a sudden attack and try to overwhelm and demoralize the enemy quickly. And it was carried through at Tippecanoe with great determination, considering how few warriors there were, and they didn't have much ammunition. The Indians were a very mobile force. They were almost like water. They gave way to things and they strengthened around weak points in a very flexible way. They didn't have to wait for orders from chiefs. They fought very much individually. So if they perceived a force getting out of its depth, moving forward and getting split up from the main force, they could easily rally round and start surrounding it and cutting it to pieces. I mean, if there had been more Indians on the ground, the Indians might have been capable of inflicting great damage.
The Indian warriors attack Harrison's army in camp at dawn. For a moment, it looks as if the Indians have infiltrated the lines, there's confusion, but as the light increases, it becomes clear to the Americans that the Indians lack the numbers, that they lack the ammunition to carry this assault home. And eventually, the Indians are driven from the field. In reality, the Americans suffered probably more casualties than the Indians. The American force was superior, the American force was better armed, the American force had more ammunition. But I do think that it represents a blow to the Confederacy.
On the night of November 8th, 2 days after the battle, Harrison's soldiers edged warily into Prophetstown for the first time, only to find that the Confederated forces had dispersed into the surrounding countryside. Ordering his men to plunder the village, setting fire to the lodges and destroying all the Indians' food supplies, Harrison headed back down the Wabash towards Vincennes, declaring in dispatches his mission had been accomplished.
Following the defeat at Prophetstown, one would think that all of this was over, and it was not. It was just the beginning, in fact. It was an impossible task of the largest scale for Tecumseh to rebuild his army, and he did, making twice the efforts, twice the stamina.
When Tecumseh comes home, he's reputed to have grabbed the prophet by the hair and shaken him, and reprimanded him, scolded him for this foolish action.
Tecumseh, we know, was very angry with his brother after this battle. And I think the prophet spends the rest of his life trying to get back into a position of prominence.
Tecumseh has a choice. Do you discard the prophet, or do you reunite with him in this kind of campaign effort? And he realizes he has to embrace him again. And he forgives his brother, and so now we're in the next chapter of rebuilding this huge army. And this time, make no mistake about it, Tecumseh is going to be there.
Though Harrison had destroyed the Indian food supplies and scattered the Indian warriors, he had not destroyed the Confederacy itself, and he had not destroyed Tecumseh, and in the end only succeeded in emboldening the great Shawnee warrior, who, on returning to the Wabash in January 1812, immediately set out to reassemble the scattered alliance, convinced, despite all appearances to the contrary, that the moment of opportunity for the Indian Confederacy was rapidly approaching.
I think in a way, Harrison creates a huge problem for all Americans living in the Northwest Territories because he disperses those who are antagonistic to the United States everywhere across the Midwest. They have not given up. They're not putting their weapons down.
All through the winter and spring of 1812, as long-festering tensions between the United States and Great Britain spiraled upward, Tecumseh labored tirelessly to rebuild the Confederacy and to shore up British support before a renewed offensive could be launched against Prophetstown. By May, more than 800 warriors had streamed back into the village, while across the Northwest, more than 4,000 warriors were on the move, the largest Indian confederacy ever mustered on the North American continent. By the third week of June, Tecumseh himself was on his way north towards a British fort on the Canadian side of the Detroit River, hoping to secure supplies and ammunition, when a messenger arrived, bearing news he had long been waiting for. 3 days earlier, on June 18th, the United States had officially declared war on Britain over the fate of the long-contested northwestern frontier. The War of 1812 had begun, bringing with it the last best hope of a permanent Indian homeland east of the Mississippi.
And of course, the British were at a crisis point themselves. They needed American Indian allies. They were fighting a war in which the odds were against them. They wanted to defend the Canadian line. And of course, they needed manpower. Only the Indians could fill that void for them. So it was an inevitable alliance at that point. Tecumseh needed them, and they needed him. On certainly Tecumseh's war aims, he was still, incredibly, I have to say, in 1812, looking at some possible way to regain the Ohio boundary as a boundary between the white settlements and the Indians. And he sold that goal to the British.
Arriving at the undermanned British outpost of Fort Malden in the waning days of June, where most were convinced that Canada would fall before the approaching American army, Tecumseh changed the military equation on the ground in less than 3 weeks, rallying wavering Indian allies to the cause and bolstering British resolve, and astonishing the British commander-in-charge, General Isaac Brock, with his extraordinary military skills and sheer force of personality.
I mean, Brock's remark is a classic one. He spoke to Tecumseh for a very short time, a mere few weeks. But he wrote back to the British Prime Minister and he says that I've talked to the Indian chiefs and there are some extraordinary characters amongst them. But here's Tecumseh, he says, a more gallant or sagacious warrior does not exist.
Tecumseh's brilliance on the field of battle in the summer of 1812 would cement his reputation among the British High Command as one of the greatest military leaders of all time. In little more than 3 weeks, the small but highly mobile force under his command completely unnerved the American army, led by William Hull, forcing him to retreat back across the Detroit River to the American side, and effectively bringing the invasion of Canada to an end. On August 4th, at the Battle of Brownstown, south of Detroit, with only 24 warriors at his command, Tecumseh attacked and routed an American force 6 times as large, killing 19, wounding 12, while himself losing only a single warrior.
Tecumseh's finest hour is probably Detroit in 1812, when Tecumseh teams up with Isaac Brock, who finally seems to be the person who's going to deliver on the promises that the British have been making so long. Tecumseh and Brock together mastermind the capture of Detroit.
On August 16th, at the Battle of Detroit, Tecumseh convinced the American defenders inside the fort that they were facing an army many times greater than their own, parading his small host of warriors again and again through a clearing in the forest. Before the British and Indian attack had even begun, a white flag appeared above the ramparts of the fort, and the American army marched out and surrendered their weapons. It was one of the most humiliating defeats ever suffered by an American army.
Fort Detroit falls, Fort Michilimackinac falls. Tecumseh and Brock, who are very close, are able to take Fort Detroit. They're able to generally gain the upper hand here on the Detroit frontier.
And it seems as if the vision of an independent Indian Confederacy, an independent Indian state, if you like, supported by British allies, but independence of the United States, is on the brink of becoming a reality.
And then unfortunately for Tecumseh, and unfortunately for tribal people, General Isaac Brock is killed fighting the Americans over by Niagara. And the new British commander is named Proctor, and he's much less aggressive and much more interested in just defending Canada and in not really helping tribal people retake part of Ohio from the Americans. Tecumseh has to continually goad Proctor to march against the Americans. They invade Ohio twice, attempting to take Fort Meigs, which was an American fort near modern Toledo, and are unsuccessful.
In the fall of 1813, the British fleet was defeated not far from Detroit at the Battle of Lake Erie, ceding control of the Great Lakes to the Americans. By then, Lalawetheka and a ragged band of followers had appeared in his brother's camp along the Detroit River in Ontario, driven from Indiana by their old nemesis, William Henry Harrison, who even now was moving north at the head of a vastly reinforced American army.
The Americans invade Canada, and particularly after Perry's victory on Lake Erie, the British want to abandon the Detroit frontier and flee to what is now Toronto, and Tecumseh makes them stand and fight.
The British Indian Army turns to make a stand at Moraviantown.